Hi folks, David Jameson here, editor of conter.co.uk. I'm joined today by Jonathon Shafi to discuss the ongoing Brexit negotiations, which obviously have now been extended. Some papers are saying until Christmas potentially, some even right up until the end of the year. That would certainly follow the pattern of EU negotiations traditionally going right down to the wire. Jonathon, first of all, give us a bit of background on this process over the last few weeks. We've seen this recurring thing throughout these entire past few years of threats of withdrawing from negotiations, or the country's happy to go out on a no deal and so on. This seems to animate a bit of shifting around on positions, and then before you know it, we're kind of back on negotiations again. What have the last few weeks been like, and what do they mean?
So I think it'd be best described as a bit of a roller coaster, but not unexpected. There's always going to be a lot of drama around these negotiations, and that's for pretty obvious reasons. One is that there's a political dynamic there, there's a negotiating posture, and there's also a range of kind of factors which make it dramatic. This was never going to be smooth sailing. Now, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you looked around the Financial Times and other serious commentators, they were feeling pretty confident that there would be some kind of deal reached. I think they probably still do feel that, particularly after the development of the extension of the talks on Sunday. In fact, Rishi Sunak said in a radio interview that they'd already had a Brexit deal. Maybe it was just a bit of a slip, but really that's where you would expect things were going. The last week, though, and on the run up to Sunday, there's been probably the most bombastic rhetoric and the most provocative position being put by the UK, but also, and this is something which is obviously missed a lot from the discussion, particularly in Scotland, which of course voted Remain, but also quite an aggressive negotiating position from the EU, particularly when you look at things like the ratchet clause. But in fact, the ratchet clause was removed without going into the details of what that means. That was the pivot around which lots of the war of words escalated over the last 5 or 6 days. And so with that being removed, with another phone call, it would appear a more successful phone call, certainly more successful than the dinner, then the talks have been extended. Now, I just want to say just at the outset, just a couple of things. First is that it's always important to remember with these things that it's true that trade negotiations can fail. That's happened numerous times. Larry Elliott's got a very good article in The Guardian where he talks about this. But he also talks about the way trade negotiations go to the wire, the way that each side will put very hard positions, and it often goes down to the wire. So if you look at what happened in Greece, for example, the negotiations there, then you saw that happen as well. And that was despite, of course, there being a popular and democratic mandate opposed to what the EU and the Troika were proposing. Of course, Tsipras went into those negotiations with the EU knowing full well that he was never going to depart from the euro. But in the circumstances around the UK, it's a different question because obviously we're not part of the euro. So there's going to be more drama. There's going to be more points of conflict. There's going to be more tension, and probably some more headlines in the right-wing press, completely rabid as they were, around gunboats defending fishermen and all that sort of stuff. But we are, I believe, going to end up in a situation where there will be a deal, and it will be a bad deal for workers.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the psychology of these negotiations is there's a great willingness in the media in particular to read the various statements that emerge from the negotiations as real reportage of what's actually happening. So Boris Johnson will suddenly appear, his usual sort of ludicrous, sort of bumptious self, and happily declare that there's going to be a no deal. And this is treated as a statement of fact, that this is his actual opinion, rather than it just being another card in the negotiations, just leveraging more pressure onto the other side of the negotiations. And as you say, like the right-wing tabloids then give it, oh, it's, spirit of 45 type nonsense, Bulldog Britain. And the liberal media completely lose the plot and start saying, we knew it's catastrophe, it's all going down the drain. And of course, the irony of that is it's playing directly into the narrative that Boris Johnson, wants. But these are all just various chips in the game of the negotiation. You said, though, that you mentioned that the EU's position in all this, and I suppose it's a truism that the British media doesn't typically pay a lot of attention to what the European Union is trying to get out of this situation and the tactics they've been deploying to get what they want out of the situation. What are those things?
Well, I mean, first thing to say about that is that there's an unfortunate situation, which is because Boris Johnson is so rightly reviled in Scotland. We often look to Ursula von der Leyen and other leading figures within the European Commission and elsewhere as if to lionise them, as if to say that these people are much more professional, some would argue much more progressive than the Tories in the UK. Of course, these people all represent European ruling class interests. They come from conservative backgrounds and all the rest of it. And so the coverage of the EU position and what they are seeking to get from these negotiations is often left wanting, as I say, particularly in Scotland. Well, what do the EU want? They need to make sure of a few things. First of all, they don't want this to be an easy process. If a country votes to leave the European Union and is able to do so easily and is able to thrive in doing so, then clearly that's a threat towards the unity of the European project, and particularly as we move into another economic crisis, and that overlaps with pre-existing tensions over the last 10 years or so. So they're looking for a degree of entanglement with the UK. So, for example, lots of people have referred to the withdrawal agreement. The European Union, the European Commission prefer to look at that as a new partnership agreement. So they're looking to protect their interests, to protect the single market, as you would expect, of course, and to ensure that the UK remains in as much alignment as possible with the regulations that have been set out. Interestingly, the UK in the run-up to Sunday did declare unilaterally that they would follow the same and align with the same standards when it came to, for example, food and animal rights. So, and animal welfare, I should say. So there's lots going on there, and of course the European Union's got an eye to its own project. The UK position is complicated by the fact that, on the one hand, there is a degree of political power in the hands of people who have come around the European Reform Group, who are very bullish on the question of leaving the EU, would do so without a deal, but that has to be balanced. We have to have a more measured and rounded view of that, because that has to be, as I say, balanced with what are the interests of the financial institutions in the UK, what are the interests of the foreign policy establishment in the UK as well. And zooming out, how feasible is it to have a permanent no-deal WTO arrangement with the EU at the same time as having a Biden presidency in the White House? Who'll be looking for far more convergence with the European Union. So when you zoom out, it's pretty obvious that Boris Johnson, far from attempting to pursue aggressively, actively, and willingly a no-deal outcome, is in fact pursuing a deal on balance, and has to do so in a way that will placate some of his backbenchers.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well that in the last couple of weeks there's been a lot of talk of this level playing field, and I think sometimes people reimagine that to be whatever they want from it. Sometimes it's imagined that that's simply about standards for things like food and services and so on, but also, of course, includes sort of, serious levers of macroeconomic policy, like, capital investment by the state in infrastructure and so on. Which is not to say that if, the reason that the Tories desperately want more distance from European alignment is because they want to launch some state programme of investment in Britain's failing infrastructure. It is more broadly for them about competition. But, it's worth bearing in mind that that's what the European regulations are actually for. They're about the interests of particularly the leading states in the bloc. Also, in the last few days, the European Commission's new plan for how to distribute emergency aid around the Union was revealed, and it included, for example, demanding pension reform in Spain in return for emergency funds. Basically showing once again what the purpose of this level playing field actually is. It's very often simply just a race to the bottom for European workers. But as you've said, the Tories aren't eager to take us out of a race to the bottom. They'll just be angling for a different route towards that. One area where it's understandable that so many people think that a no deal is the most likely outcome, I suppose, is simply that what's happening right now has never happened before, not with the European Union anyway, that an important member state has quit unilaterally from the bloc. But I think as well, and I want to hear your opinion on this, there are a lot of assumptions here about what the post-break relationship would look like. I think a lot of people imagine there's going to be some great divergence. The UK is going to go one way, the European Union is going to go another way, and never the twain shall meet again. Where in reality, what you're going to see is a highly complex continuing relationship between the UK and the European Union, subject to constant revision, subject possibly to a shrinking of the distance between the two countries, potentially. It's entirely possible. Subject probably to new institutions that binds the economic interests of the UK and the European Union together. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Brexit negotiations, in fact, are never really going to end. Whatever the outcome was on Sunday, they would always have resumed in some form. So even if a no-deal scenario is arrived at, that would, in my view, simply reset the negotiations. That there would be further negotiations. The idea that the UK can have a situation where it is permanently operating on WTO rules with the world's largest single market and with such a large trading partner, I just don't think it's sustainable. So I think that would reset the negotiations. But beyond that, you're right. Look, if a Labour government comes to power, for example, they may want to look at some of the issues around environmental standards or workers' rights in a different way than, for example, the Tories would. So whatever they come up with will be subject to review, to further negotiations and discussions in the future, and as the years go by. It should also be said, by the way, that when we talk about there will be a deal, obviously the deal is not going to be a good one. That's obvious. But secondly, the deal itself will be full of the kind of toolkit of trade negotiation mechanisms which are available. So, for example, when it comes to an area of contestation, well, let's keep things as they are for the next 6 months, then we'll come back and review it. Let's not let it derail the deal in its totality, for example. So new institutions will probably be set up as a result of Brexit, which will mediate the relationship between the UK and the EU. So this idea that there's going to be, in Nigel Farage's words, this clean break with the UK becoming a sort of global enterprising nation, making free trade deals right across the world and all the rest of it, without alignment to the EU in some form, through some mediated deal and through other means, review systems and all the rest of it, is, in my view, pretty unconvincing. Just to touch back on one of the points that Larry Elliott did make, is that, yeah, trade negotiations can break down. You know, it is possible that the time on the clock does run out, and that the negotiations do run out of time, they do break down, and it leads towards ill feeling and all the rest of it. But again, you have to alongside that, balance that with what are the institutional interests, what are the interests of the markets, what are the interests again of security, of the foreign policy establishment, and all the rest of it. So again, the idea that the British state is pursuing no deal, I think is a misreading of the situation. Just lastly, we talked in a discussion, touched on some of these issues a few weeks ago, about Whitehall, and we shouldn't forget that the British state is not just Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, is the civil service, is a whole range of units of organisation around which the British state pursues its own interests. And in Whitehall, they were talking about this mantra of Biden presidency, a Brexit deal, and a vaccine in order to start to rebuild economic growth and to attempt to stabilise the political situation. Now, we've already went into detail about the difficulties that are with that, but again, it does show you where people are thinking. I do think there still is, despite the fact that they have been so in such disarray over these last few years, I do still think that there is some form of ruling class strategy going on here that is well beyond simply leaving the EU without a deal.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, part of the calculations about achieving a deal, and this will be known on both sides of the negotiation, will be that, you know, a vaccine has just arrived. Biden recently won the presidency. You know, it's the middle of the Christmas holiday period. I mean, these are real considerations in driving both sides towards a deal. And we also shouldn't imagine, I mean, the fallout probably would be worse for a British government if they didn't achieve a deal, but it would actually be bad on several sides simultaneously. It wouldn't cover any of the governments involved in any glory if nothing was achieved here. I mean, bearing all that in mind, right, and leaving aside for the moment that we don't actually know what the outcome of these negotiations will be, where does this leave the leadership of the independence movement in terms of the arguments that it's been making around this question? I mean, in the last couple of months, you have seen some leading figures in the SNP very deliberately pouring cold water on the idea of a no deal, or de-escalating the rhetoric around this idea that Britain is imminently going to face this catastrophic collapse out of the European Union. So, for example, at the recent SNP conference, I saw politicians use the slightly lame phrase of no deal or low deal. There's been so many of these now, various permutations of deal that are bad and so on. I mean, it seems to me that a lot has been predicated on this idea of a sort of imminent collapse, that there's about to be a huge sudden downgrading of Britain's position in the world system and so on. I mean, hasn't that just sort of set us up for, you know, a weakened mainstream case for independence?
I think you're right to point out that there has been a bit of a change among some of the leading SNP figures. Now, Ian Blackford's not someone I agree with on a great many things, but I think he has probably been correct to start talking in terms of a bad deal rather than no deal, because that's probably, again, we don't know for sure, but that's probably the situation that they're going to have to navigate. It's interesting that Nicola Sturgeon didn't rule out on CNN the SNP backing a potential deal as a means to prevent a no-deal situation from arising. Now, the arithmetic in the Parliament probably wouldn't rely on SNP votes, given the Labour Party is probably going to vote for the deal. but it may well do if there's a large enough rebellion inside the Tory party, and if there are a number of Labour MPs who vote against it as well. So that will be an interesting thing to watch. But the overriding point there is that, this is going to have an impact on the national question. It's going to have an impact on the independence cause. Just briefly to go through some of the reasons why. First is that there's no doubt that Brexit has eroded so much legitimacy when it comes to Westminster in the eyes of people in Scotland. There's no doubt that the vote to remain, compared with the potential of things like a no-deal Brexit, or indeed any kind of Brexit when it comes down to it has stretched the democratic deficit to breaking point. It has, I believe, created a situation in which many people who voted no in 2014 would consider voting yes now. And I think it has built support for independence on the basis of how Brexit has gone and on the fact that Scotland's been taking out the EU against its democratic will. But there are a couple of problems and complexities which then come into play. So the first is that if there is a deal, I do think that will change the political atmosphere. I do think it's a very different scenario than the UK leaving without a deal. If there is a deal and there is a degree of economic certainty that comes from it, that has an impact. If there is a deal and Brexit begins not to dominate the political agenda that it has towards the latter part of this year after the COVID pandemic, and if there is a sense in which people feel that there is the possibility of some stabilised economic and political relationship with the EU that will have forks in the road, that will have ongoing review mechanisms, as we've touched on, so on, I think that'll have an impact too. But what really will have an impact is the fact that the SNP's currency position prohibits membership of the EU. So sterlingisation with the rest of the UK, even if the UK has a deal with the EU, would prohibit Scotland becoming an EU member for at least 10 years, which is the length of time which we are told it would take to transition from sterlingisation, meet the 6 tests, and come to our own currency. I also think that alongside that, there's another dynamic here which is often missed, and it's the sort of thing that if you say on Twitter, people just get annoyed at you. So I take that on board. But when Macron, on the lead up to Sunday and the latest Brexit deadline, talked about welcoming Scotland and independent Scotland into the EU, when various figures in the European Parliament and in the European Commission say similar things about Scotland and welcoming Scotland into the EU, people have to understand that is negotiating leverage. That is Scotland being used in the negotiating process as a means to build political pressure on the UK government, because they know that the UK government is weak on the Scottish front. However, that doesn't mean that they're going to overturn the rules of the single market to allow a country in that doesn't have its own independently controlled central bank, that is sterlingised with the UK who has left the EU. It would not be possible to do that given the nature of the the EU single market, which requires economic and trade harmony and so on. But secondly, there are other questions here. So there are questions, for example, around Catalonia, around Spain, which actually has been probably even a greater crisis for the EU than Brexit, if you look at it in its totality over the last few years. So there's a whole range of dynamics there, which I think will compel the EU to be far less welcoming of the prospect of an independent Scotland joining the EU after a trade deal is made, and bearing in mind all of those political dynamics. So I think the question will change, and this is why, just in conclusion, this is why it's so important that when people talk about Brexit in the Scottish context, those of us who support independence, that we do so in a way that puts it as a component of a much wider democratic deficit and of a much wider case for Scottish independence, one that can stand on its own terms outside of the question of Brexit. That's something which the SNP leadership have not done. Stop Brexit has been their happy place over the last 4 years. That is where they have been most comfortable talking, about the political situation, that they oppose Brexit. It's very clear. They've got the public on board for it and so on, and it's a way to confront the Tories. Where they've been less confident is on the question of independence itself. Less confident in the economic case, because we know that the Growth Commission is taking a battering, and also less confident about how they're actually going to wrest a referendum as well from the Westminster government, from the Tories. So all of these things combined mean that we have to be alive to not just the openings that Brexit has provided in terms of the national question, but also some of the pitfalls and some of the ways in which it can become a swamp as well for the independence cause.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make. I don't think anyone would deny that the situation in 2016, where 62% of Scots voted to remain, and then were taken out, despite that vote, I don't think anyone would deny that that doesn't show very clearly the profound democratic deficit that the British state experiences. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the question, I mean, this is another thing that's going to become, I think, apparent as time goes on, is the idea that the SNP leadership has tried to promote about the European Union is, well, Scotland can almost sort of remain again in the European Union so that we can have the same relationship with the European Union as we had before January this year, where Scotland, as part of the UK, was a member of the European Union. We've got to remember, when Scotland was a member of the European Union as part of the UK had a highly bespoke deal with the European Union. It's sufficiently important to the European Union that Britain was accommodated on the currency. We didn't have to use the euro, but actually Britain had all kinds of opt-outs relating to its financial industry and all kinds of stuff. Scotland would not be offered that sort of relationship ever again. In truth, we don't know what type of relationship we would ever be offered, if any, right? But let's just assume for now that there would be a pathway for Scotland to join the European Union. We have no idea under what terms that would be. Scotland would be very different from the accession countries of recent years, for example, from Central and Eastern Europe. So we have no idea what that relationship would look like. And fundamentally, under any terms, Scotland would be a very different member state of the European Union, because we'd be more like the many small countries like Ireland or Portugal, who in recent years have fallen foul of the EU authorities. So we're talking about a radically different scenario, and that's just further complication. If it came to a referendum in the next 1 or 2, 2 or 3 years or something like that, that's a whole other discussion that we then need to have if the independence case is joined at the hip with the concept of European Union membership. I mean, it's fine for an independent country to have that conversation about what international organisations it seeks to be a part of and which it doesn't. But there's a profound dishonesty about almost everything that's involved in the process of joining the European Union. I mean, you said there that it would take 10 years, during which we'd be Starlingized, according to Andrew Wilson, who seems to still be making policy on behalf of the entire independence movement, despite being unelected, despite having no position of authority over the movement proper. But he's in the papers dictating what an independent Scotland is going to look like. He said it would be at least 10 years. But then even after those 10 years, we don't know what the process of alignment to the European Union would look like. We might have to run disciplined budgets for several years in a row. And look, in 10 or 15 years' time, we also have absolutely no idea what the European Union is going to look like. It's changing all the time under the pressure of events. So I agree with you, so much better to make the case, the democratic case for independence, one based on the improvements that can be made in the conditions for people who live here and the democratic empowerment of people who live here, rather than instantly farming out what independence means to a body of foreign institutions like the European Union and NATO and so on.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with that. But it's an interesting point that you pose. Let's say that that Scotland could enter the EU. First of all, I mean, we're doing so with having barely any negotiating position at all. When it comes to what would be expected of Scotland as being a member state. And the examples you give there of Ireland and Spain, I think, are good ones. I mean, people talk about, well, Scotland's got this vast renewables energy potential and all that sort of thing that could be a supply of energy to Europe and so on. I mean, look, that is true, but you have to remember that the SNP government has already started selling off all of our green, renewable and natural assets to global investors. Now, that's already been sold off. People don't necessarily tie these questions together, but they're very much interconnected. And so it does really reinforce to me that the SNP haven't put any serious thought or planning into this. And it's also just worth saying that the Brexit process has also offered unionists, while they've had a great problem on the Scottish front as a result, for the reasons that we've already outlined, there's also, because of the way the SNP have related to it, and not just the SNP, but others have related to it, offered them a range of tools that they can now wield in the debate. So, for example, they can talk about the need for a confirmatory vote. They can talk about the need for potentially a quorum when it comes to how many people vote, because they want to make it as difficult as possible to use Brexit and the arguments made by those who pursued a second referendum, for example, against them. But other things as well. Every single time that an SNP politician tweeted or posted or went on the media and talked about how Brexit was terrible for the markets and about how this was something which couldn't be countenanced as a result of that, well, I'm sorry to say that the prospect of independence will not be something that is welcomed with open arms by the markets. So you can't on the one hand make all these arguments against Brexit, and when they come back round and are posed when it comes to independence, simply say to yourself, well, that doesn't matter, this is a different question. These arguments will be used against us. And the other argument, of course, that will be deployed is, look how difficult Brexit was. Just imagine, I mean, that's a 40-year relationship. Just imagine how difficult it will be to decouple Scotland from the UK and to do so after many more years of integration than the UK had with the EU. So I think Brexit is really contradictory when it comes to independence. On the one hand, yes, it has increased support for independence. The way it's been handled, the fact of it existing, the fact that Scotland voted to remain, all of that stuff. I'm not arguing with that. What I'm saying, though, is that you can't just look at those issues. You also have to look at the range of other issues which make it difficult for Scotland to achieve its independence if it is tied to the need and becomes reliant on EU membership and simply being Scottish independence, simply being a response to Brexit. It has to be something much wider, much broader, and much more concrete, I think, when it comes to how is Scottish independence going to increase people's living standards? How is it going to tackle the great challenges of our time? How is it going to do so more successfully as an independent nation? These are all questions which have to start to come into play. And just lastly to say, really, this is what should have been happening over the last 4 years. The broad case for independence being made, not trying to overturn referendums in England that are going to come back and bite you later on when you come to have your own referendum. For example, building a currency position that is a proposition that would prohibit EU membership, but instead using the time that you had to let the idea of a Scottish currency, an independent Scottish currency, bed into to the minds of the electorate and into the discourse of Scottish politics. But those years, in my view, have been squandered. Now, the latest independence poll has yes on 52 and no on 48. Now, that's good. It's still a lead for yes in the polls. But I would not be so sure that if and when there is a Brexit deal struck, and you add in all the other factors that I've tried to outline in this conversation, that you don't see that part of middle-class Scotland who's been drawn towards the idea of independence because of things like Brexit start to retreat once again towards where they will see the possibility of a more secure future within the UK. Now, people get annoyed when you say this because they think it's your view. It's not my view. But it is my view that forewarned is forearmed, and that we should have in place a serious plan for independence and a vision for independence which goes well beyond Brexit and the European Union.
Okay, Jonathan, thanks very much for speaking to me about that. If you go to conta.co.uk, you can read more about the Brexit negotiations as they unfold, the consequences for the Scottish independence movement and for wider society. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.